Hey, beautiful people. Thank you for tuning into the High Fantasy Podcast. We have another author interview for you. Today we're interviewing Mr. James Jakins. James is the author of several series, including Thunder's War, Broken Redemption, and the BLOODFIST books. James' latest book is Jack BLOODFIST Freelancer, which just released in late April. A voracious reader and writer of fantasy, after being the last in his class to learn how to read, James is now a flourishing author and lives in Utah with his dog and cats. Shalini and I had a great time talking with James. He's got a very interesting take on fantasy characters and races and using them in ways that are very unconventional and subverting a lot of tropes. On that note, enjoy the interview. Cheers. Alrighty, folks, thank you for tuning in to another author interview on High Fantasy Podcast. We are here today with Mr. James Jakins. James, thank you again for coming on, and if you could, just please describe for us your current work, your newest release as well, Jack BLOODFIST Freelancer.
Of course, and thanks again for having me on. So, my books, I write primarily fantasy. That's what I love. My books can probably be described as fast-paced, exciting, occasionally funny, hopefully never boring. All my series are very different, and I just try to write whatever excites me at the time.
I've seen that you've done quite a few different series, as you mentioned, and you'd like doing not series or like sequels, but more like books that are in the same universe or stories that are in the same universe. Can you talk a bit more about that process and how you came to write about this universe where there's like orcs who are hired to carry out missions and things like that?
Yeah, of course. So my first novel was Jack BLOODFIST Fixer, and yeah, it's starring an orc in a suit, and he likes to believe he's a fixer, that he can fix people's problems for them. That kind of started. That one was kind of an accident, if I'm being honest. I'd been spending all this time trying to write, the kind of more traditional epic fantasy, those big door stoppers that could kill a chihuahua. And I just wasn't like having that much success. So really finishing one that I liked, and there was just something about it that wasn't working for me. So I decided to take a break. Maybe I had to, teach myself some new skills. So I thought an easy skill to learn would be pacing. So I decided I was going to write a thriller, just a straight, action thriller story.
Yeah.
And in the process, through some other stuff, it kind of ended up just being this book about an orc living in Virginia, going up against an angry paladin. And so I wrote that one, and it was really fun. In writing it, I hadn't intended for there to be any sequels. It just kind of was going to be the standalone thing. But as I was going through the various drafts, the story kind of expanded and the world grew, and I introduced all these other characters that I really liked. So after that one, the second one that's kind of attached to it is a novella I released a few years ago called First Fixer. And it was just a little story about the main character, Jack, about his father and how he kind of established himself as their city's, orc fixer. And then my other series, Broken Redemption, is sort of a spin-off of that one as well. The villain in Fixer, I just liked him so much that I gave him his own series as well.
And then you have A Thunder's War, which is quite different. It's a bit more traditional, you would say?
I would say it's more traditional, yeah, and it's its own separate thing. It's not tied into the BLOODFIST books.
Though I did read somewhere that you had, I think, was it a vehicle or something that was named Orcs? Like it's the acronym.
Yeah, I called it an ORC off-road card or something, just so I can have Orcs in the book.
That's awesome. So you have a pretty big obsession with orcs, at least for being part of the story. So what made you have an orc protagonist? Because we always see, like in traditional fantasy, they're always the villain or they're the funny side character.
Yeah.
Or,
James, you're the first person we've ever spoken to that has a traditionally evil race as the protagonist. So this is
really
interesting.
Well, I have a few friends that write orcs as well. So there's a few of us.
Wow,
there are literally dozens.
Yeah.
So the rate like I've always had a thing for orcs. Like, could probably blame Blizzard on that. Like playing Warcraft as a kid, I always chose the orc campaign over the human campaigns because they had the cooler units.
Totally.
But for this story, the way it kind of happened is like I mentioned before, I've been planning on just writing this this thriller. It's like it was going to be a practice book. I was trying to just teach myself a few new skills to kind of add to my catalog. But I have another writer buddy who we always pitch ideas back and forth, and I was pitching a couple ideas to him. I just mentioned that I had this idea for a story with goblins in it.
Okay.
And he said, I only like that one if you make the goblins the good guys. And so as I was like planning out this practice novel, I realized I didn't want to just write a straight thriller. I had to have fantasy in there somewhere because it's boring to me without it. I didn't want to work on it unless it had those elements. And so then throughout the course of planning the book, I remembered his comment that he wanted a book where the goblins are the good guys. And so kind of through that lens, it ended up with this half-orc, half-goblin protagonist. Then like all the other supporting characters around him are the characters that are generally viewed as either maybe not evil, but not necessarily the heroes. And then so by that, through that lens, sort of the villain had to be this paladin of justice. So I kind of just flipped all the roles just to make it, I hope, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely an ironic way of writing fantasy because you like you just said, you like flip the script basically, and you're showing a total difference of perspective. I'm interested in how you write the paladin character. Like, is he kind of like is he in any way reckless, or is his righteousness, so to speak, fanatical? Because that's something that we see in paladins that are good characters. Whenever they go astray. And this is actually in the Warcraft series. Like they become so wrapped up in this narrative of them fighting evil. Is that kind of what you did for that character?
Sort of. Like in writing the book, I kind of realized that religious zealots make really good villains. Just because, like the best villain is the one that believes he's doing the right thing, right? And
interesting, yeah.
If your god tells you to do something, of course it's the right thing to do. So yes, so he's, like I said, I really am fond of the character, but he does really come across as a very not nice person in Fixer. Yeah, so he's just doing what his god told him to do. These orcs desecrated their temple, decades ago, and he's finally found them. So he's gonna get revenge for that.
What made you decide on the urban fantasy setting? Was it kind of a natural sort of jump from sort of the grungy, edgy sort of like personality that would come with an orc, or was it just something that you wanted to do because of the reason you wanted to do a thriller, instead of like an epic fantasy where it's like medieval based setting?
Yeah, it was really just a result of the fact that I had that plan to start with, that I was going to write this, by the numbers thriller story. But then when I decided, no, I'm just going to replace all the characters with, these fantasy races, and then to kind of, add in more like epic fantasy sensibilities to it as well, the setting just never changed. It just always felt like it was the right place for this story.
Mm-hmm. It's cool because you don't get a lot of fantasy characters in other types of genres, like in sci-fi or in thrillers, as you mentioned, or like you can see them sometimes in horror and things like that. But I think that shift from traditional to like more grim, dark fantasy has kind of allowed that to happen, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, even a lot of fantasy today is increasingly anthropocentric. Well, to name like a really huge one is Game of Thrones, which season 8 is obviously out at this time.
Yeah.
Like there's no direct reference really to there being elves or dwarves or other races of note. There's obviously magic and there's magical creatures, but it's very to use like going back to the religious term, it's a very secular kind of fantasy world in general when it comes to that standpoint.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a counter movement in fantasy. Like back, Tolkien introduced us to the genre, sort of, and he had the elves and the dwarves, and then everyone that kind of came after him did the same thing. So everyone that grew up reading those books, like, well, I can't do the same thing. So I guess I'll just go, everyone's a human now.
What inspired the BLOODFIST series for you?
So I grew up, I was a big Wheel of Time fan. Which is why when I was first starting out writing, I really wanted to write that big, massive 14-volume epic.
You won't be around to finish it.
I think there's still a bit of that influence, like especially in my Son of Thunder book, which is still, I think it only just breaks 300 pages. It's not very big. It's very fast paced. There are sequels planned, but it's very self-contained. It's almost standalone. So even with that that background, that inspiration, I can't write those big books, or I'm just not willing to, I guess. Yeah, that's a big one for me. One of my first books I read, Chronicles of Narnia, The Hobbit. I was a big Redwall fan as a kid.
Oh my God, Redwall.
Yeah. So I mean, the classics.
Yeah.
And but for the Jack BLOODFIST for Fixer, the way I plotted that one, I did the outline in 3 days, and I sat down and I did a binge watch of every thriller movie, every action thriller that Netflix had, like the Jack Reacher, the Jack Ryan, and that's why he's named Jack.
Oh my gosh! Okay.
So yeah, I just watched every, whether they were good or bad or just everything. I just watched all of them to kind of drown myself in that tone and try to recognize all the tropes that I liked, that I wanted to avoid. And then from that, I wrote the first draft in 3 weeks.
Wow.
Just kind of writing off that Netflix binge.
Yeah. Yes, you definitely got a really good high, so to speak, from that. And I know what that feels like when whenever I rewatch a Lord of the Rings movie, you get so engrossed into it, and you feel like I'm just on this fantasy rush now. I want to write because I have all these ideas and feelings in me. But yeah, so James, you talk a little bit about your process for getting that set. What's your writing process in general? Do you have a kind of more eclectic approach to it, or do you are you very methodical? Or
I'm not sure if I could say traditional, because I think every writer kind of has their own routines and things they do. So I kind of take the Asimov approach, whereas he would write a story or book until he hit a wall or was bored with it, and then he would jump and work on something else, and then he'd come back to the original one more excited. I've started doing that in the last year or two, so I've usually got 2 or 3 books that I'm kind of juggling. Whichever one I'm most excited about at any given time is the one that I am focusing on. I usually do an outline to start with. I never actually follow the outline. It's just so I feel more confident starting it. There's a blank page when you first get started, but I know what's supposed to happen. So it's a little easier to just get the words going that way, even if the outline only lasts 2 or 3 scenes.
Yeah.
And then I just try to get through it as quick as I can, and then send to beta readers, rewrite or revise until I'm happy with it.
Segueing into another question we had, on Goodreads, you answered a question about what you dread the most when you're writing a story. And I'm just going to quote your answer because I feel like it's really resonant with writers, and it really did for me as well.
Yeah.
So you said, not being able to get my idea on the page in the right way. I always have that idea that I love that makes me want to start a story, that one little touch or theme or character that I want to get across to the reader. I'm constantly afraid that I won't do it justice. So this idea of doing the idea justice, of putting it down on the page, and you can do all these things with outlines and things like that to just get over that hump and get it started. But how do you now as an experienced writer execute your idea and make sure that you try to give it justice? What are the strategies that you use?
Oh man, I wish I had a good answer for that, but it's really just I try to put the words down, and I've had to I think it's something every writer kind of has to learn, is that first draft, it doesn't have to be perfect, but if you can get something on the page that is almost sort of close to what you wanted, then at least you have something there that you can add to, that you can polish, that you can revise and fix.
Mm-hmm.
But that's still a thing. I don't think I'm ever going to get over that, being afraid to, do it justice. But I try. That's really the only thing I can say, is you have to try to hopefully get something that's not the worst.
I think this is a common thing in a lot of art forms too. I know I've spoken to musicians, they'll hear a riff on a guitar in their head, and they'll try to execute it as perfectly as if they've heard it, and it never is the same thing. I like to draw, and I'll have an exquisite image in my head of what I'd like to draw, and it is just never the same. But as long as I feel like like you said, if I just tried my utmost to replicate it, I'm usually pretty happy with what the result is. And then usually it's something that's entirely unique unto itself in the same respect. So I think that what you experience is quite common. And I mean, your approach is simple, but like very admirable. There's something to be said about that.
And I think we as creators are kind of inundated with this idea of the genius, and we always see people who can like just hear something in their head and then just perfectly replicate it, like on the piano or on a canvas or whatever. And that's kind of our societal idea of what an artist is, or a creator. And it's really not how it is. It's, you start with this crude
we see that like end result, right? Like the guy that can hear that song and just play it perfectly. But what we don't see is the thousands of hours he spent perfecting that art form, right?
Yeah,
it's true.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, or even someone like Mozart. Like, we all can't be like Mozart, who just like, he was born with all these musical talents and ideas.
Yeah, and about artists too, like fine artists, like so many of them were themselves like obsessed with mathematics and science, but because they were in a time when those things were very undeveloped, this was the medium that they used to channel the curiosity into.
Yeah, art is such an interesting form, because people have so many ideas about what it is, and then there's like the people who actually do it, and there's quite a dissonance, I think, in terms of how people think like they can, like, a lot of people want to write a book, but like they never actually get to that point because they're afraid of this idea of trying and not getting the idea perfect, or that they have to have a certain talent, or have to have done a master's in creative writing or something, but
or they have to have time to do it, or something like that.
Exactly. I mean, writing is just trying, I guess. It's a good takeaway.
That's pretty nice. That should be a t-shirt.
I think it's it.
Okay, that's it. We're done here, guys. We solved it.
Yeah, we've permanently solved.
Just try.
Exactly.
Welcome, everybody.
So in terms of like writing, you also do anthologies, or like edit anthologies as well, so you're not just part of your own sort of creative process. So you recently co-edited an anthology for charity called Where There Are Dragons, an anthology of mixed emotions. So how did you get involved in this process? How did you go about choosing the stories? Because I heard that you included both award-winning and debut authors. So I thought that was really interesting. And if you could speak about the process a bit more, that'd be really cool.
Yeah, so that I've done one anthology, and it was an amazing experience. So I have my own little publishing imprint called Robber's Dog Pub. It's mostly just for some of my books, and I have a few friends that I've helped publish like short story collections for.
That's really cool.
And one of them, Austin James, is his writer's name. He and I have been he and I are the third editor. There were three of us: myself, Austin James, and Joshua Main. We've just kind of been playing around with the idea for a while. I was like, hey, we should do an anthology. And originally the plan was we would just do we'd each write a novella and throw all three together and release that just as kind of a fun little side project. But then a few years ago, in February of 2017, one of my best friends committed suicide. It was just devastating, as anyone that's experienced that can attest to. And then kind of just talking again, we kind of revisited this idea of doing an anthology. And Austin, he he's really good at the networking side of things, which I am not. So he just knows a lot of other writers, knows a lot of people, takes a lot of workshops and classes. And he kind of pitched the idea as like, hey, look, I know all of these amazing writers. What if we invite them to do this anthology that we talked about, so however long ago? And I said, yeah, I like that. Let's do an anthology on one condition. It has to be for charity, and every story has to have a dragon in it.
Okay.
And so the dragon thing was because my buddy, when he committed suicide, he loved dragons. Like, that was his thing. If there was ever, like, if I wanted to get him to read a book, but he'd be like, oh man, but I've got like 20 books on my list. I'll add it to the list, but it's going to be a while before I get to it. I just be like, hey man, there's a dragon in there. And it'd be the next book he read because he loved dragons so much. So that was my, my thing for the anthology. There has to be a dragon somewhere in the story, even if someone just says the word dragon once. That was our only stipulation.
Yeah.
And so he sent these invites out to a lot of his writer friends. I asked a few of my writer friends. Everyone I invited turned me down. But so as a result, we got, I think we have 20, maybe 19 or 20 stories and poems in there. And they're all just people invited. Some of the people he invited had won awards already. We met a few people at cons, like going to Comic-Con and stuff. We talked to a few writers and just, made offers. Like, the first story in the book is by Eric James Stone, who won the Hugo or Nebula. I always get those two mixed up.
Yeah.
But he's an amazing short story writer. He won Writers of the Future as well. So we just ran into him at a con and said, hey, you want to be in our book? He said, yeah, okay. And so it was just really fun getting to meet and talk to other writers and just invite them into the process. Then stories were sent in. We found the ones we liked. There were a few we kind of sent back for rewrites, but generally almost every story that was sent, we just, for one reason or another, loved it. It's kind of genreless, meaning like there's no set genre of the anthology. We've got sci-fi, fantasy, literary, a couple horror stories. There's some poetry. So there's no guarantee that everyone's going to like every story, but there's at least one or two stories in there that everyone is going to like.
That's awesome. I just love the idea of the dragon as a central character, and we were talking before about fantasy characters not really diving into other genres that are out there besides fantasy. But more recently, obviously, that's been the case. So this is, again, something, a book that kind of defies those kind of stereotypes where dragons are only for fantasy books.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's really awesome. And you mentioned that all the, like, some of the proceeds, is it all the proceeds or some of the proceeds?
All the proceeds,
oh,
100%. So any book that's sold, so if you buy a paperback, there's some printing costs in there. If you buy the ebook, Amazon charges for delivery or whatever, but 100% of the royalties we get back. Yeah, we're just sending charity. And there's no set charity for it for now. We're doing the National Suicide Awareness Hotline or whatever it's called. But we're always open to suggestions if anyone knows of, like, charities that benefit suicide awareness or mental health that could use it. We're always open to those suggestions.
That's amazing, and we'll leave a link in the description below for if any of our listeners want to purchase the anthology as well. And I definitely think that I'm definitely interested in buying it, so probably gonna get a paperback or something.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, it's a great cause.
Yeah, thank you.
Coming to the end here, we're going to talk a bit more about the technical sort of processes of being a writer. So I've noticed that you use Patreon as a writer, and like Morgan and I haven't really seen writers use Patreon as much. It probably is different for you, as you know many other writers, and writers have to kind of use whatever platforms they can to share their work, but also, make some money and get some, well-deserved recognition and things like that. So I think it's a brilliant way to provide extra content and also provide sneak peeks to fans while still, doing what a professional would do and get paid for your work. So how do you personally use Patreon, and how has it affected your interactions and your experiences with fans, and how would you recommend emerging authors use Patreon?
Well, so I love Patreon, but I I like it more as a patron. Like I support a lot of artists, and I have some writer friends on there that I like to, throw a little bit their way every month. The way I use it is fairly simple. If depending on the level people support at, they can get arcs of my new releases. I throw up sample chapters. Right now, I'm working on the sequel to my novel Knights of the Dead God, and I'm throwing up 1 or 2 chapters a week on there.
Nice.
Just it's still the first draft, so it's there's going to maybe be some typos, and so it's not going to be maybe the story that there is when the book releases, but it's a little behind the scenes look at the process, and hopefully a fun story to read in the meantime. They are changing the way they do things now for anyone that's maybe considering using Patreon. The deadline's probably passed, but it's now going to be almost a subscription type plan for creators. Like I think there's a monthly fee associated with it. They recently changed that. But if you had an account before then, you're kind of grandfathered in. You still so I was lucky. I get to have like the premium membership for no charge just because I've been there for so long.
Okay.
But it is a puck thing. I know quite a few writers that use it. I think for a lot of them, it's just like, hey, here's my newsletter, here's my blog posts. But there is, the occasional free story or new story, stuff like that. But really, the thing I love about Patreon is it is a way if there's someone that you like and you want to support them, the option's there for you to do that.
Yeah.
It's definitely been successful for a lot of podcasters and YouTubers, and I like it, and I've taken advantage of it before to support. Because I listen to a lot of podcasts that are for free, but they say you can support us if you want to, and then I feel kind of like, well, I've been consuming all this content for free.
Exactly.
And so
they're providing you a service in a way, right?
Yeah.
Like you pay for Netflix, maybe pay for these podcasts you listen to, 5-6 hours a week, whatever.
And I think the fact that it's all entirely voluntary, it's almost like more of a reason that they're not saying, oh well, all my stuff is behind a paywall.
Yeah, that's why I love Patreon. Like I said, I support. I use it more to support other creators than I do for myself. But I have the option there for if anybody feels like they want to support me a little bit.
Yeah. And it's nice too, because in sort of the digital world, we're so inundated with free stuff, and people they have this assumption that digital content is always free, but then there's people who actually do want to pay
for quality content.
Yeah, for quality content, or actually just help support the artists that they enjoy. So I really like that sort of idea, even if it's in the real world or in the digital world, where it's you pay what you can and then you get, additional content or a certain type of content.
Yeah, and the model is at a certain point, if you have so many followers, even if they are paying $1, it adds up, and it's quite substantial. And if you have people that are more generous, and that it's great, it becomes a way to sustain yourself. So
we go to the local art gallery, and it's pay what you can on Tuesdays, and we still pay the recommended amount. So it's not we're not here's 25 cents.
Yeah, I know.
You can show some human kindness through things like Patreon and pay what you can models. So yeah, really cool. So what are you working on now, James? And just tell us a bit more about your plans for the near future and your works.
All right, so many plans right now. My current project, the one that I'm so close to the end, I'm pushing to finish this draft. It's a novel called Gods of the Broken Sea. It's the sequel to Knights of the Dead God, which released last year. So sort of a sword and sorcery / portal fantasy type novel. I'm very happy with it. I think it's going to be hopefully well received. And then after that one, the next one that I'm really eager to jump back into is the sequel to my novel Son of Thunder. It's right now the title I'm working with is Lightning's Price. I'm hoping to have that one done, or first draft done sometime this year for a release next year. And then I've just got so many other books that are just eventually they're going to make their way to the top of my list. But those are the two that I'm really most excited for right now that I'm hoping we'll see released soon.
Yeah, and you picked like really rockin' titles there, James. Like these could be the names
Thank
of
you.
bands.
Yeah, so Sons of Thunder.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
What was it? Lightning's Price?
Lightning's Price, yeah.
Yeah, that is straight up. There's got to be a metal band somewhere. With that.
Probably. It's actually a funny story. For Son of Thunder, that was my second novel I released, and it's probably my worst title. But the reason I kept it, because I Googled it to see, like, does any other books have this title? And I found one that I'm pretty sure was Viking Erotica.
Oh my god.
But that was so funny to me that I had to keep that title just so I could say I had the same title as that book.
Oh my God.
So it's probably a bad decision, but it's the one I stuck with.
That's so awesome.
So if someone Googles Son of Thunder, they'll
Yeah,
get two
you'll
very
probably
different.
see a topless Viking before you see my book.
Yeah. Oh my God.
I love that. Viking erotica.
Yeah. That's the first time I've ever heard of this genre, but I'm not at all surprised that it's happening. Given the recent popularity of so many like Viking like books or games or whatever. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Hilarious.
Wow. Well, sir. Good luck with those. And
Thank you.
Yeah. Wait, James, is there? But before we kind of wrap up, anything further you'd like to remark on or let people know about?
Buy my books, please. No. You can just find me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Bethtiva, BETHTEVA, Facebook, James Jakins author. You also have my fan page, Jack's Place. I'm on Patreon. You can just search James Jakins and you'll find me. And
and we'll definitely keep a lookout for your books as well.
Yeah, and the anthology again. We're gonna we'll link in the description.
Oh, thank you very much. That actually means a lot. That's the one I want to sell the most right now. Just well, not right now, but as long as it's in print. So
yeah. Alrighty, so Mr. James Jakins, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. You have a very interesting and unique style of writing, and I say this about everybody that we speak to. But I think you truly have some very like genre-defying aspects of your work, and obviously you're a really passionate writer. You have a lot to say about the processes that are used, and I think you're like very open-minded about it, which is great, and you don't seem to have a ton of traditionalist itches, which is quite refreshing, especially these days. So again, we're really excited to hear more about you and your work, and again, thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you, and best of luck with everything.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you like this episode of our podcast, you can follow us on our social media to get updates on our future episodes. On Facebook, we're at facebook.com/highfantasypodcast. On Instagram, we're at highfantasypodcast. And on Twitter, we're at podcast_fantasy. And don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube as well. Thanks.